How often the police do not hurry to investigate the disappearance of a teenager, assuming that the girl or boy ran away on their own, and parents, with tears in their eyes, are forced to assure the officers that their child would never do such a thing. But what if this is precisely the case when the teenager did indeed run away from home, not just once, but multiple times? Does the child deserve something terrible to happen to them just because they decided to rebel? Should they not be searched for just because they supposedly brought it upon themselves? Tanya Cash was born on October 14, 1981, in the family of Jerry and Sherry Cash. The family lived in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, a town with a population of fewer than 10,000 people. The first 7 years of Tanya's life were very happy. Her parents fulfilled all the whims of their beloved daughter, traveled a lot, and spent time together. But when Tanya turned 7, it became noticeable that her mother had mental health problems. It started innocently enough. She could laugh without reason and behaved somewhat irrationally. But when she began setting fires, leaving her young daughter alone at home, and engaging in affairs on the side, Jerry couldn't help but pay attention to it. After Sherry attacked her daughter with a knife, Tanya was 11 years old when her father decided to divorce his wife. Despite the man's decision being for the safety of his daughter, it greatly affected her. It was very difficult for the girl to understand what was really happening. Sherry was temporarily placed in a mental health facility, but upon her release, she attempted to forcefully enter the family home, where she was prohibited from returning, and she harassed the family. Therefore, Tanya's father didn't want to risk it and hurriedly took his daughter further away from Sherry. He had just met a woman named Joanna. Joanna lived in the town of McKeesport, Pennsylvania, with her 7-year-old son. She told Jerry that she would be glad if he and his daughter moved in with her. Jerry saw these relations as a fresh start in life for him and his daughter. However, Tanya wasn't happy about the move, and there were many reasons for that. Firstly, McKeesport ranks as the 4th most dangerous city in the USA, making it unsafe for a young girl to wander around the town. At home, it wasn't any better for her. She felt as though Jerry, Joanna, and her son would be better off without her, as if nobody wanted anything to do with her. Finding solace at school was also impossible. Other girls bullied her, assuming that a blonde with big blue eyes could easily steal their boyfriends. Soon, she got into a fight at school and was suspended. After that, school became even more unbearable for her. Tanya started skipping classes and running away from home. While running away, she wandered around the town, heading to her grandmother's, aunt's, or mother's place, with whom she occasionally met despite everything. Jerry repeatedly sought help from the police, but every time his daughter returned home on her own. Therefore, by her 3rd runaway, the situation began to resemble the story of the boy who cried wolf. Despite being in one of America's most dangerous cities, the police had more to deal with than just looking for a troubled teenager who ran away after yet another argument with her family. Therefore, when Jerry and Joanna woke up on February 10, 1996, and didn't find their daughter at home, they assumed she would return in a day or two as usual. Still, Joanna got into the car and began driving around the town, trying to locate Tanya, but she was nowhere to be found. However, after 4 days, their concern grew, and Jerry reported her disappearance to the police. Jerry thought his daughter might have run away to her mother, who was covering for her. But as expected, the police didn't immediately take action, and Jerry and Joanna had to search for their daughter on their own. A few days after the girl disappeared, Tanya's grandmother found a possible lead. The last time the girl was at her place, she left a piece of paper with a phone number on it. The grandmother called the number, and a woman named Judy Sokol answered. The girl's connection to an unknown adult woman who worked as a hairdresser and had no affiliation with the school seemed strange to Jerry, and he passed this information to the police. Judy Sokol told the officers that her home had been a refuge for teenagers and children who had run away from home. She provided them with shelter, food, and clothing, after which they either returned home or went elsewhere. The last time Judy saw Tanya was in December 1995. The girl ran away again and asked Judy for a jacket. After that, Judy didn't see Tanya again. Since the girl had returned home after that previous incident, the police bid farewell to the woman and left. After a week since Tanya's disappearance, Jerry and Joanna searched through their daughter's room to find any clue as to where she might have gone. In her dresser, they found a note of inappropriate content written by a man. It contained an offer to Tanya to provide an intimate service. The spouses immediately realized who had written it: their neighbor, Kevin Churchfield. Not long before Tanya's disappearance, she told her stepmother that she and Kevin had gone out for a snack. Joanna asked if they were with a larger group, but no, they were just the two of them. Of course, Joanna found it strange that the older man showed interest in the teenage girl. However, Tanya brushed off her warnings and said they had simply discussed the time when she would babysit Kevin's child. And now it turns out that Kevin did indeed make inappropriate advances towards Tanya. Jerry and Joanna went to the police, but he himself did not expect what he would hear from the investigators. It appears that several months before Tanya's disappearance, she went to the station alone and filed a complaint against Kevin for his inappropriate behavior towards her. The girl had to sit alone with the officers and tell them that every time she went to Kevin's to babysit his child, he would suggest intimate things and even force inappropriate physical contact. Jerry and Joanna were shocked by what they heard because they had no idea about Tanya's visit to the police. But another shocking twist awaited the couple in Kevin's case. Kevin Churchfield was arrested, however. The court hearing was scheduled exactly when the girl went missing, and since, according to the law, Tanya needed to appear in court to proceed with the case, but she didn't show up, the charges were dropped. It was hard to believe that these events were not connected. Kevin underwent a polygraph test. Although he had previously denied inappropriate behavior towards Tanya, he admitted to it, but vehemently denied any involvement in her disappearance. The polygraph examiner even asked if he killed Tanya, but he stood firm in his denial. The police obtained a search warrant for his home, but they found nothing. Essentially, there was no evidence that he abducted or killed Tanya, and it was impossible to charge him with inappropriate behavior due to the absence of the girl. Therefore, the man had to be released. Weeks turned into months. Joanna decided to go back to her stepdaughter's room and sift through her belongings, thinking they might have missed something. And indeed, between Tanya's mattress, she found a diary. Overall, it was no different from any other teenage girl's diary. There were thoughts about life, boys, parents, but something stood out. The name Tom appeared repeatedly in the diary. Neither the father nor the stepmother had any idea who this Tom was. However, it seemed from the diary that Judy Sokol knew Tom, with whom the police had already spoken. Investigators pondered whether Judy might know more than she wanted to show and returned to her house. That's when Judy told them she had heard that Tanya liked a guard at her school. His name was Tom Hose, and Tanya even confessed her feelings to him in a note. The police decided to go straight to Thomas's house. The 38-year-old man lived with his parents and son and worked as the head of security at the school. Thomas was surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet. He thought she would have been home long ago. He explained that he informed the school management to avoid trouble and was worried that someone might think something inappropriate was happening. He generally regarded the schoolgirl's infatuation as something innocent and not deserving of special attention. Towards the end of the conversation, officers asked if they could enter the house quickly and inspect it. But Thomas replied that his parents were asleep and would be frightened to see the police, so he suggested they come another time. The police left, and after checking at the school that the guard had indeed reported the girl's note, they concluded he was telling the truth and crossed him off the list of people who might know something about Tanya's disappearance. Interestingly, when Tanya's mother Sherry was informed about her daughter's disappearance, she thought to check the phone bills. She found the number that her daughter had last called when she was at home. Sherry dialed it, and a man named Thomas Hose answered. She asked him if he knew where her daughter was, to which he replied that he had no idea what she was talking about. Despite this, Sherry still reported it to the police, but they dismissed it because after speaking with Thomas, they were convinced he had no involvement in the disappearance. For 2 whole years, the investigation remained at a standstill. Jerry saw the case being forgotten right before his eyes, and he couldn't change that. However, in July 1998, the body of a teenage girl was found at the cemetery in McKeesport. Many were convinced it was Tanya, but she was identified as 14-year-old Kimberly Krim. She had been assaulted, but it was impossible to determine the cause of death. The police began investigating her murder and discovered that another girl had been killed in McKeesport 3 years earlier, Anna Marie Callahan. Anna Marie's body, a 16-year-old, was found in the river with a wire around her neck and tape on her wrists. Anna Marie, Kimberly, and Tanya were all teenage girls of similar ages, described as attractive but troubled. They all attended the same school. This led investigators to speculate that Tanya might also have been killed and her body hadn't been found yet. They also feared a serial killer might be on the loose. As horrifying as it sounded, the discovery of Kimberly's body became the catalyst that prompted the police to reopen the investigation into Tanya's disappearance nearly 2 years later. They reached out to the Missing and Exploited Children's Center, and Tanya's photo appeared on 400 million milk cartons. But there were no leads. The cases of all three girls remained unsolved, and it continued like this for years. A whole 10 years passed since Tanya's disappearance. Suddenly, there was an unexpected breakthrough in the case. On March 21, 2006, a man called the police. He reported that Tanya Cash was in the house of Thomas Hose, the school security guard. The police were unsure whether to understand or believe the caller because they had removed Thomas from the list of suspects many years ago. Nevertheless, they dispersed to their cars and headed to the man's house. After knocking on the door, they heard Thomas exclaim, "Oh darn, it's the police." However, the door had already been opened. The officers identified the girl, but clarified if she was called Tanya Cash, and she replied, "Yes." Then, the girl turned to Thomas and said, "It's all over." Has Tanya been living peacefully with Thomas all this time and simply didn't think to let her parents know that everything was fine? No, everything was completely different. Tanya met Thomas at school, where the 14-year-old girl attended classes, and the 38-year-old man worked as a security guard. He approached her in the school corridor, noticing that she was new there. Other girls considered the guard to be mean and unfriendly, but he was quite friendly towards her. Thomas took an interest in her difficult home life, and when she was surprised and asked how he knew about it, he replied that it was part of his job. Indeed, he persuaded the school psychologist to show him the girl's confidential documents. Thomas took advantage of a time when Tanya was at her most vulnerable. Her life became difficult in the new city, at the new school, after her parents' divorce, and she was desperately striving to fit into her new environment. It seemed to her that Thomas was the person who genuinely cared about her. He gave her the attention she lacked at home. He was cheerful, constantly joking, and treated her kindly. Once he found her skipping class. She was scared he would report it, but he said he wouldn't. And it was the first time he leaned in and kissed her in the school corridor. The real horror of this story is that everyone in the school knew about the inappropriate relationship between the security guard and the student. The director either didn't want to or didn't know how to solve this problem, even though Thomas himself reported the girl's note with romantic content to her. The director attempted to transfer the girl's class to another section of the school, but it didn't change anything. The psychologist discussed the violence she experienced at home. However, the police lieutenant, responsible for maintaining order in the school and dealing with problematic children, behaved the worst. The security guard informed him that she was a troubled teenager, often lied and made false accusations. Additionally, she was involved with older men. However, the lieutenant didn't even attempt to take any action regarding this matter. Meanwhile, having gained the trust of the school and even the police officer, Thomas began to act more actively. On another occasion, when the girl complained that she was unhappy with her father and stepmother, and there was no place for her at her mother's home, Thomas suggested that she escape and live with him. The man promised her that they would have a wonderful life together, and he would take care of her much better than her parents. Considering that the girl was only 14 years old and heard these words from an adult who was the only one to show interest in her, she believed him. In January 1996, Thomas began to develop a plan for Tanya's escape. Early in the morning on February 10th, she was supposed to run away from home and go to Judy Sokol. Thomas believed that staying with Judy was a great idea because nobody would suspect Tanya being with her, and she would be the last person associated with her disappearance. As soon as Tanya appeared at Judy's house, she cut and dyed the girl's hair. For a whole month, everything was excellent. Tanya lived at Judy's and Thomas visited them. Thomas and Judy were kind and caring towards her, and it seemed to her that it would always be so. But she still didn't fully understand what was happening. A month later, Thomas drugged Tanya so that she barely understood what was happening. It was the first time he violated her, taking away her virginity. Around the same time, Judy told Thomas that Tanya couldn't stay with her any longer, and it was time for her to leave. Therefore, seizing the moment when his parents weren't home, Thomas took the girl to his own home. Thomas led Tanya to his bedroom on the second floor, and it was precisely there, in the tiny room, that she lived all those years. For the first few years, she was not allowed to leave the bedroom at all, so that the man's parents wouldn't find out that someone else was living in the house, even to use the restroom. Tom placed a bucket for the girl to use for that purpose. She used the same bucket to brush her teeth late at night and early in the morning. Tom fed his captive sandwiches with peanut butter and jam along with bananas. At best, twice a week she was allowed to take a shower in the basement after Thomas's parents went to bed. She wore either Thomas's or his son's clothing. Tanya learned every creaky floorboard in the house to avoid stepping on them when Thomas's parents were home. She kept her room locked from the inside, and when Thomas coughed as he ascended the stairs, it was a signal for Tanya to open the door. Tanya admits that she felt like a dog, waiting for the owner to return home. Certainly, the violence against her was constant, before the man went to work, after, and before bedtime. However, the door locked from the inside. Why didn't she escape? Thomas adeptly manipulated her mind. This tactic wouldn't work with a girl from a loving family, but Tanya believed she wasn't wanted at home, and Thomas played on those strings, constantly reminding her that her parents weren't looking for her, that nobody needed her, and it was better for her to stay with him. The poor girl couldn't know that in the first few months after Jerry's daughter disappeared, Jerry spent countless hours driving around McKeesport, trying to find Tanya, passing by Thomas's house many times as they only lived 2 miles apart. When Jerry wondered where his daughter could be after these 10 years, the last thing he could assume was that she was just 10 minutes further down the road. 2 years later, Tanya decided she had had enough. Her health started deteriorating, and she decided to leave Thomas. It seemed like he wasn't holding her, but it wasn't that simple. Threats poured in from her tormentor. He insisted he would kill her, strangle her in her sleep, take her out of the house, and throw her body into the river. He also threatened to harm her family. He started telling her about 2 other girls who were killed, hinting that he killed them. Incredibly, but soon Thomas allowed Tanya not only to leave her room, but also to go out of the house. The first time Thomas permitted Tanya to leave the house, he allowed her to go to the store. A man handed her $120 and a list of things she needed to buy. The girl confesses that she was terrified when she had to go to the store because Thomas pressured her, explaining how she should behave, look down, not talk to anyone. And when she returned, the man was waiting for her to quietly escort her back to the bedroom. Over time, Thomas gave his victim more and more freedom. But when she left the house, she had to introduce herself with a different name that he gave her, Nikki Diane Allen. In doing so, she continued to live in the same town where she lived before her disappearance. Her father's house was only 15 minutes away from Thomas. However, since so many years had passed and she had changed physically, becoming older, people were not actively looking for her, not trying to see the same face they once saw on all the milk cartons they bought. In 2005, Thomas's father's health began to deteriorate, and Thomas informed the family that he was dating a girl named Nikki, who would move in with them and help take care of the house and the sick. For the next 10 months, she was allowed to roam around the house. She also went to church, met people. Tanya often visited a store located down the street. As a regular customer, she got acquainted with the owner, Joe Sparico, his wife and daughter. In them, she saw the perfect family she had always dreamed of and tried to spend as much time with them as possible. At some point, Joe offered Tanya, whom he knew as Nikki, a job. Nikki told Joe about herself, living with a 45-year-old man. Joe found this strange. It wasn't the 22-year age difference that bothered him, but rather how she spoke about her boyfriend. Joe sensed something was off and tried to cautiously inquire about Tanya's life, but she dismissed his concerns, reassuring him that everything was fine. However, as she analyzed her life and the normal, loving family life of Joe, his wife and daughter, Tanya realized how unhappy she was. This culminated on March 20th, 2006, when they were alone in the store chatting. Suddenly, Tanya burst into tears. Joe, of course, asked, "Nikki, what happened?" That's when she looked at him and said, "My name is not Nikki Allen, it's Tanya Cash." She told Joe everything that had happened to her over the past 10 years, the constant abuse and being kept in a small room for a long time. Joe promised to help her. He told her to go home after work and behave as usual so as not to alert Thomas. That evening, he called the police and reported that Tanya Cash was being held at her home by Thomas Hose. When Tanya confirmed to the officer that she was indeed Tanya, they immediately took her out of the house and brought her to the police station. Thomas was arrested, and Jerry was informed that his daughter had been found alive. At first, he didn't believe his ears and thought it was a prank, but it wasn't a joke. When he rushed to the police station, Tanya was indeed there. The reunion with his daughter he describes as one of the wildest, insane, but joyful moments in life. Because although Jerry never lost hope, He understood that the chance of finding his daughter alive after 10 years was almost zero. The father took his daughter home, and the next day she returned to the police station to give her statements. Meanwhile, the police searched Thomas's house and found a diary in which he recorded details of all instances of violence against his victim, including all the gruesome details. He even had colored notes for various intimate preferences. He kept the diary not just for himself, but to boast in front of friends and colleagues. The police also found that he lied about his work experience when hired, and the school didn't even conduct all the necessary checks, allowing him access to children he was supposed to protect, but was, in reality, preying on. 3 years after Tanya's disappearance, students praised him for his merits and gave him a commemorative plaque, stating what a wonderful guardian he was. If only they knew. The man faced a series of charges related to violence and endangering the girl's life. However, he was not accused of kidnapping because Tanya came to him willingly. In 2007, Thomas pleaded guilty to the charges of violence. During the trial, Thomas claimed that only God knew how ashamed he was, but Tanya was lucky, and she should thank him because without him, she would already be dead. In response, the judge remarked that he had too high an opinion of himself. The man was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Judy Sokol, 58 years old, was sentenced to imprisonment for a term ranging from 6 to 23 months. Thomas was not charged with child abduction, a crime that is punished very severely in the USA. He also wasn't accused in connection with the cases of Kimberly Krim and Anna Marie, although while awaiting trial, an informant from the prison claimed that Thomas had confessed to killing Kimberly. Interestingly, Tanya vividly remembers the day when her body was found. On that day, Thomas entered the bedroom, announcing that Kimberly had been found dead. Tanya was upset. She knew Kimberly from school, and Thomas's reaction, cold and distant, puzzled her. He stood there with crossed arms and simply said something like, "You knew it was all leading to this." There is another chilling detail that might be just a coincidence, but it's also possible that it's not. The graveyard where Kimberly's body was found is visible directly from Thomas's bedroom. However, to this day, he has not been officially linked to these girls, and Tanya is devastated that she cannot say for certain whether he is guilty of their murders or not, because she still doesn't fully know what he is capable of. Unfortunately, after Tanya was rescued, she faced a barrage of criticism from people who couldn't understand why she didn't just leave. Among the accusers were Jerry and Joanna. Although her father acknowledged that Thomas could have had psychological influence on Tanya, he couldn't understand why she couldn't just walk away. After all, Thomas's bedroom was often left unlocked from the inside, and she was frequently left alone at home. Moreover, she escaped on her own. She wasn't taken from the bedroom, and there was no weapon to her head during the abduction. Therefore, Jerry and Joanna essentially claimed that she chose this fate herself. The father also wanted to hear Tom's side of the story because, in his words, there are 3 sides to the story: Tanya's, Tom's, and the truth. Unlike Tanya's father, the police considered this a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome, a bond that develops between a victim and their kidnapper. Victims genuinely believe they depend on the kidnapper, that they are needed. Tanya herself admitted that she was drawn to her tormentor like a magnet. Each time she left, she felt compelled to return to him. Moreover, if everything were as one-sided as Jerry envisioned, his daughter wouldn't have had a multitude of health problems due to what the assailant did to her. She underwent a hysterectomy, a surgery to remove the uterus. For a year, she was connected to a colostomy bag, and she suffers from arthritis because she couldn't develop normally as a young girl confined to a tiny room. Not to mention the constant nightmares, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anorexia that developed over these 10 years. Therefore, the violence inflicted on her by Thomas will continue to haunt her for the rest of her life. It is highly unlikely that she would have chosen such a life if she had known what awaited her. Tanya filed a lawsuit against the city and the school district because neither the police nor the school took any action regarding the relationship that developed between the security guard and the student. She also filed lawsuits against Thomas and his parents, but they were unsuccessful because too much time had passed. However, when her autobiography was published, lawsuits were filed against her, including by Jerry, Joanna, and her psychologist, who did not like how they were portrayed in the book. But thanks to the book, it became clear that she was let down not only by her parents, school, and the police, but also by the Child Protection Organization. On January 5, 1996, a month before her escape, Tanya had a physical altercation with her stepmother, and Joanna threw an ashtray at her. Family neighbors called Child Protective Services, who spoke with the girl's parents, the school psychologist, and the police lieutenant assigned to the school. This lieutenant told the Child Protection Service that Tanya was a problematic child, always lying and accusing others of everything. The lieutenant went to the girl's home and threatened to place her in a facility for troubled children if she continued. Child Protective Services suspended their intervention in Tanya's case. Is it surprising, given all this, that after everything she went through, she believed that the only person who cared about her was a monster manipulating her? Thomas was unable to be released early, but in February 2022, after serving 15 years, he was released and moved back to the same house where he had kept Tanya. Tanya lives 15 minutes away from his house, and she still fears running into him, for example, on the street or in a store. It was challenging for Tanya to rebuild her life after such trauma. She was convinced that the old Tanya had died, and it was crucial for her to understand how to live on. She suffered from nightmares, and everything was a struggle. However, she survived, obtained an education, studied business at university, and got married. Due to everything Thomas subjected her to, she cannot have her own biological children, but she is raising her husband's son and daughter. She wants people to know that even after such a severe trauma, there is hope. Teenagers who run away after being preyed upon by adults are still victims, and they should not be blamed for what happened to them. Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police, but the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action, so she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there. With whom? The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago, the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth. But in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Pitești. But Pitești is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Pitești, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have 1 husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula. But instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy, to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home, her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her, but Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus, in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her? But it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents, but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Olinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows, and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Celendin, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed. And the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter, and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country, and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story.
Marcela Borges and her husband Rubens Murray, along with their son Ryan, came to the United States from Brazil to start a new chapter in their lives in another country. They settled within the walls of a beautiful mansion in the affluent neighborhood of Winter Garden, Florida. Winter Garden is a very safe place where one can peacefully stroll down the street without any fear of a robbery attack. Their nearest neighbors became Teresa Shuffield, her husband, and their children. The sons of both families were of the same age, and the two families soon became friends. The happiness of 27-year-old Marcela knew no bounds when she learned she was expecting a child. She couldn't even imagine that her quiet life would soon turn into a real nightmare. On the morning of Sunday, November 15, 2009, the family sat down to have breakfast when the doorbell rang. It was unusual. Marcela asked her husband if he was expecting someone, and he replied no. He went to see who it was but barely had a chance to open the door when four strangers burst into the house. They threatened Rubens with weapons and demanded that he not take any sudden actions. One of the men held their 5-year-old son. The boy asked his mother what was happening, but Marcela herself couldn't understand anything. She was scared and felt completely helpless, unable to help him. The men wasted no time. They grabbed electronics and other items they considered valuable. Marcela and Rubens hoped that the intruders would take what they wanted and leave, but they soon realized that they came for something more. It seemed they had a plan that went beyond a simple robbery. The strangers began examining Rubens' business papers, clearly trying to find something specific. Rubens Murray, 48 years old, held the position of director in a successful transportation company, and they were looking through his financial accounts. As they ransacked the house, the men started conversing about something. Marcela couldn't understand what was happening when the robbers led the entire family to the garage and made them sit in their car. They tied Rubens' mouth and eyes shut. She had seen such things in movies or in the news, but she could never imagine herself in such a situation. Initially, she thought they wanted to abandon them somewhere on the street, and while the victims received help, the robbers would escape in the stolen car. But then she overheard them speaking on the phone. Someone was giving them instructions on what to do next. Now, Marcela had no doubt that this was not just a random robbery. While they were driving, the woman tried to memorize the direction and the road, taking advantage of the fact that the criminals didn't close her eyes. Unexpectedly, she noticed a patrol car. She desperately wanted to open the window and call for help from the officers. But the robbers also noticed the police, became nervous, and ordered their victims to stay quiet. Marcela and her husband couldn't make sense of where they were being taken, and why they became the target of the robbers. Especially since kidnapping was unheard of in Winter Garden. What they didn't know was that the criminals had been observing them for months. This was not a random attack. The criminals had thoroughly prepared for it, assessed the value of their home, and determined the success of Rubens' business until they concluded that the family had money. Evening fell when the family was brought to a trailer park in Apopka, Florida. Marcela was horrified to see where she ended up. The neighborhood was clearly different from what she was accustomed to. Adults were drinking and smoking without any regard for the children who wandered barefoot on the dirty streets. Marcela had never seen anything like it. The criminals led the family into a certain house. It resembled a family home, but not of a normal family. The robbers brought the family to the trailer park for a reason. They were convinced that the spouses had hidden a pile of cash somewhere and were willing to do anything to make their victims reveal its whereabouts. They demanded a specific amount, $200,000, no more, no less, and claimed that someone was directing them who knew everything about the family, and knew that they had money. Marcella couldn't understand anything. How could these people, with whom they clearly had no connection, know anything about her family or their financial situation? She was certain that a mistake had occurred, and the criminals had taken the wrong family because Rubens didn't have such a huge sum. Meanwhile, the other members of the gang got down to business. They ransacked the family's winter garden home upside down. After several hours of searching, they discovered a hidden safe and decided that Marcella and Rubens must keep their fortune there. The guy guarding the trailer house door received a phone call. Answering the call, he demanded the code for the safe, threatening to kill the boy. Marcella was truly scared. Rubens didn't resist and gave them instructions on how to open the safe. He still held on to the hope that once they got the money, the criminals would leave them alone. But no. There was only $30,000 in the safe. For many people, $30,000 is a huge sum. For Marcella and Rubens, it was practically all their savings. However, the kidnappers were dissatisfied. They were convinced that the family had much more. The victim's reluctance infuriated the criminals. The most aggressive one, Oscar, began to take action. He grabbed Marcella, and when Rubens asked what they were going to do to his wife, Oscar declared that he would kill her. This time, they blindfolded Marcella, took her out of the house, and once again made her sit in the car. Meanwhile, the family's neighbor, Teresa, noticed that she hadn't seen her friend for a while and wondered where she had disappeared to. But she and her husband didn't pay much attention to her absence, assuming that Marcella, Rubens, and Ryan had gone somewhere for a weekend getaway, perhaps even back home to Brazil. But Marcella wasn't relaxing. They were living a nightmare. Her family had been held captive for over 12 hours. And now she feared that they were being taken to certain death. She sat in the back seat of the car with her eyes blindfolded. When the blindfold was removed, Marcella saw a woman. She could only see her eyes because most of her face was covered with a scarf. Marcella was surprised to see a woman among the gang of robbers. After all, they knew she was pregnant. She had mentioned it to them when they burst into her house that morning. Nevertheless, the presence of this stranger didn't faze Marcella, and she realized that this young woman, keeping an eye on her, was actually the leader of the gang. Her name was Bianca. Marcella was convinced that the kidnappers were scouting a place to dispose of her. Instead, they brought her to a place she least expected to see, back home in Winter Garden. It was barely recognizable. The robbers had emptied out everything that could have the slightest value. Marcella felt even more devastated because she and her husband had worked hard to lovingly furnish their family nest. In the house, the robbers persisted in their demand for money from Marcella, threatening to kill her son. Marcella began to cry, pleading that she was telling the truth. Despite Rubens holding a managerial position, he managed the company's finances, not his personal money, and certainly not cash. But for some reason, Bianca and her gang were convinced she was lying. Her stubbornness only enraged them further. They called the other members of the gang who remained at the trailer park and announced that they could kill the boy right now. Marcella heard her son's cries as one of the robbers on the other end of the phone grabbed Ryan. The woman didn't want to believe that the robbers had done something to her son, but the last thing she heard before the connection was cut was the scream and sobbing of her husband. Bianca and Oscar demanded that Marcella access her husband's bank account and transfer all the funds from Rubens' personal and business accounts to her own account. There was $23,600 in total. After that, they stated that she could take a shower and rest because they would go to the bank in the morning. As they drove to the bank, fear gripped Marcella. She was afraid that something could go wrong, and her worries were not in vain. In situations involving hostages, the longer it lasted, the higher the likelihood that something would go awry. Especially since the gang had sent Oscar, the most hostile of the robbers, with her. And he was determined to prevent her from escaping or signaling for help. Arriving at the bank, Oscar warned Marcella once again not to do anything foolish that she would regret. Fortunately, Everything went smoothly at the bank. Marcella withdrew the cash, put it in her purse without looking, and exited. In the car, Oscar reassured her that they would now leave them alone. He would take her home and leave her there. Upon entering Marcella's house, she saw Ryan and felt an incredible sense of relief. It was a true miracle. She had been so afraid that the robbers had harmed him, but the boy was alive and unharmed, although deeply frightened. Remembering Oscar's words, she believed that they would now be left in peace. However, her husband's cry brought her back to reality. The nightmare was not over. A loud sound, as if someone had been struck in the face, reverberated, and she realized that the robbers were beating her husband. She reminded Oscar of his promise, but he no longer spoke to her. If up until this point the robbers had focused their malicious intentions on Marcella, now it was Ruben's turn. The criminals were convinced that he would lead them to the $200,000 they believed the family was hiding. They took a revolver, loaded it with only one bullet, and began to play on the man's nerves, pointing the weapon at his head and pulling the trigger. It was torture. The man screamed and cried, insisting that he had nothing to offer the robbers, but they decided to raise the stakes. They held the gun to the boy's head and offered Rubens to borrow the necessary sum from friends, colleagues, or business partners and transfer the money to his wife's account. Rubens agreed. He called both his subordinates and business associates, and even his boss, asking them for an excessively high amount. Marcella understood what her husband was trying to accomplish. Of course, his colleagues responded that he was insane and they couldn't lend him such a sum. But he hoped that they would sense something was wrong and alert the police. However, for some reason, they didn't do that. On the next day, November 17th, Marcella started feeling unwell. She was worried about her child and asked to go down to the kitchen and have some water. Bianca, who never took her eyes off Marcella, began to pester her with questions about her husband's company's income. Marcella didn't know such details. Then Bianca declared that they would kill her. Poor Marcella had no doubts about it herself because 3 days had passed, and the robbers realized that someone could come to their house or the police could show up at any moment. Marcella felt despair. She knew they had nowhere else to get money, and if they were going to take any action, it had to be now. When Bianca turned away, Marcella grabbed a kitchen knife. She had never fought anyone before, but she was determined to switch places with the criminal and kill her, even though she didn't know how she would do it. Marcella lunged at the leader of the gang. A fierce fight ensued. Bianca's scarf, which she used to cover her face, fell off, revealing her as a very beautiful girl. Bianca realized that she could now be recognized and became furious. She called for help, screaming that Marcella was going to kill her. Bianca's accomplices threw a revolver from the second floor, which she quickly grabbed. She pulled the trigger once, twice. However, since the robbers were playing Russian roulette with their victims, all that could be heard were clicks of an empty chamber. Marcella got lucky as the revolver turned out to be unloaded. Nevertheless, the gang vented their fury on her. They dragged Marcella upstairs, passing by Rubens, whose face displayed horror. His eyes seemed to be asking, "Marcella, what have you done?" Marcella's brave attempt to save her family had failed. Now they found themselves in even greater danger than before. But in the midst of this chaos, Rubens glanced at the gang leader, Bianca, and recognized her. Meanwhile, Bianca started beating Marcella with a weapon, striking the young woman's beautiful face and breaking her nose. Marcella was bleeding profusely, in great pain, and she decided to feign unconsciousness to stop the assault. It worked. The robbers left the room. For a moment, everything fell silent, but then the gang members started discussing what to do with the victims. Judging by their screams, they had decided to kill the family. Believing that she, her husband, and her son had only moments left to live, Marcella took a huge risk. If she had brought the situation to this point, she would also have to be the one to save everyone. The only way out was through the window. She was, of course, concerned about the potential harm to her unborn child from jumping from the second floor, but she had no time to hesitate, so she leapt, landing between two air conditioners below. She fell onto her knees and hands. It was a painful landing that didn't go unnoticed by the robbers. But Marcella didn't wait for them. She ran to Teresa's house, shouting her name. Teresa was sitting in the living room when she heard screams. She saw a woman at the door, trying to enter. At first, she thought her neighbor had been beaten by her husband, but upon closer inspection, Teresa realized it was Marcella. Marcella was screaming that robbers had invaded her house. Marcella begged Teresa to call for help when Oscar emerged from the corner of her house, raising his weapon. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger multiple times. A bullet entered Marcella's body from the back, passed through her left side, and shattered her wrist. Only when Marcella saw a police officer did she feel safe. She cried out that the kidnappers needed to be stopped, as they posed a threat to her husband and son. Marcella feared that they had either been killed or the criminals had fled with them in her car as hostages. Inside the ambulance, Marcella was informed that Rubens was alive. Upon entering the house, the officers immediately heard cries for help. It was the homeowner, Rubens. He had been severely beaten, his head was bleeding, but his concern was solely for his son. The officers also feared finding a dead child who was nowhere to be seen. Finally, in the farthest room of the house, they spotted the child huddled in a corner. He was just sitting there, unresponsive. Before taking Marcella to surgery, she was informed that her son was also safe. Meanwhile, the two robbers, cousins Victor Manuel Sanchez, 20 years old, and Miguel Diaz Santos, 25 years old, were captured less than a quarter mile away from the house. Oscar Diaz Hernandez, 19 years old, was arrested the following day, but Bianca dos Santos remained missing. The police believe she is hiding in Bolivia because her mother is from there, she is familiar with the area, and she may feel safe there. As Marcella, Rubens, and their son slowly recovered, they learned the whole truth about the attack. Bianca intentionally targeted Rubens, using their family business to gather information about his financial situation. Bianca and her mother had a company that assisted clients with tax evasion, check fraud, and other financial matters. Rubens had been their client. However, prior to the attack on the family, the U.S. tax authorities informed Bianca's mother that they owed over $100,000 and must make payments or face imprisonment. This likely motivated Bianca to target Rubens. Bianca surrounded herself with ruthless killers who were in the country illegally and were virtually untraceable. She believed that Rubens' family would be an easy target. She did not expect Marcella to fight back or confront her. Victor and Miguel were sentenced to life imprisonment, but the leader of the gang, Bianca, is still successfully evading justice. On the other hand, charges against Oscar were dropped with Marcella's consent. After his arrest, Oscar attempted to end his own life, resulting in him being in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. To prevent American taxpayers from bearing the burden of his care, Marcella agreed to drop all charges against him. Now, Oscar's mother can take him back to their homeland. Despite Marcella's fall from a great height, it did not affect her unborn child, and after the appropriate time, a perfectly healthy and wonderful boy named Lucas was born into the family. The arrival of Lucas and the joys of family life allowed Marcella to eventually find peace and stop constantly looking over her shoulder. Partly as a result, she wanted to forget what had happened and decided to forego pursuing legal action against Oscar. According to the police, if it weren't for Marcella's bravery, they would have had to investigate 3 murders. Marcella herself firmly believes that any person, any woman, seeing their family and children in danger, will find the strength to do whatever it takes.
An enjoyable and relaxed time in the park turned into every parent's nightmare when 9-year-old Charlotte Senna disappeared in the blink of an eye amidst the crowded park in Greenfield, New York. Dozens of people immediately started searching for her, but Charlotte seemed to vanish into thin air. The case of Charlotte's disappearance captured the country's attention within seconds. It's a thriller full of unexpected twists and events unfolding before our eyes. It's a harrowing tale of a child abduction, tireless searches, and an incredible turn of events that stunned everyone when the kidnapper provided a crucial clue to solving the case, and perhaps not just one. Charlotte Senna is a 9-year-old girl, a 4th-grade student, living in Greenfield, Saratoga County, with her parents David and Trish, along with her 2 sisters aged 4 and 10. Her father, David, works as a pipeline mechanic, and her mother is a food inspector for the Stewart Shops chain. They're an entirely ordinary working family, and Charlotte's parents could never have imagined that their daughter would become the target of a repeat offender, intent on using her to improve his financial situation. However, evidently, no one is protected from the nightmare turned reality. On Saturday, September 30th, 2023, Charlotte was enjoying a picnic with her family and friends at Moreau Lake State Park, located just a 15-minute drive from their home. The park, situated 70 kilometers north of Albany, New York, spans across 6,250 acres and is named after the Moreau Lake, surrounded by a sandy beach, 158 picnic areas, walking trails, and marvelous dense forested areas. It's a highly popular recreational spot offering opportunities for boating, fishing, and its convenient proximity to other resort towns attracts visitors from various corners of the state. It was here that Charlotte's parents, David and Tricia Senna, decided to relax with a large group. Around lunchtime, Charlotte went cycling with her friends. After a few rounds, she was about to return to the camping area when she told her friends she'd do one more lap by herself and then join everyone. It was approximately 6:15 p.m. at that time. However, after 10 minutes, her parents noticed her absence. They began to search for her, calling her by name, and other park-goers immediately joined them. People rose from their tables, abandoning their food to help look for the child. The place of her disappearance turned into chaos. Finally, at 6:45 p.m., Tricia found her daughter's bicycle. That's when every mother's or father's worst nightmare began. At 6:47 p.m., the parents were already calling the police. They were certain that Charlotte had been abducted and were horrified to have lost half an hour already. How did the girl's parents realize she had been kidnapped? Her bicycle provided them with a clue. Charlotte wasn't the kind of person to suddenly abandon her bike and start walking. Why would she get off it when she could ride with the breeze? It would have been different if the bike had broken down, but it was in excellent working condition. Furthermore, it wasn't lying on the path. It was standing on its kickstand. So something, or more likely someone, found a way to get the girl's attention, stop her, and then abducted her. By 7 p.m., police officers arrived at the park. The fact that the bicycle was found, yet Charlotte was nowhere nearby, undoubtedly led to serious concerns about her safety. However, the police couldn't immediately dismiss the possibility that the child might have simply gotten lost. Therefore, efforts were made in both directions. Media outlets promptly spread information about the missing child. Dozens of people searched for her, but the situation worsened as it was getting dark. By Sunday, more than 100 people were searching the park, and another 300 joined them the following day. They checked various phones that were in proximity to the park. Fortunately, the police had the opportunity to interview everyone who had come to the park for recreation, because visitors were required to register and pay an entrance fee. However, this took time, and officers increasingly suspected that the girl had indeed been abducted when, despite their diligent search, they couldn't find her nearby. Moreover, the scent trail of Charlotte was lost almost at the same spot where her bicycle was found. If it was indeed an abduction, the abductor likely had a vehicle, took the girl inside, and quickly drove away. Consequently, the stakes had risen dramatically. Just 3 hours after the abduction, hopes of finding the child alive dropped significantly. This is because more often than not, a criminal sees the victim not as a child, but as an object to satisfy their intimate desires. Once they achieve their goal, the victim becomes a witness, evidence of their crime, that needs to be eliminated. Of course, this discussion doesn't concern a parent abducting a child due to custody disputes, but rather a scenario where the abductor is an unrelated person targeting the victim. Right after Charlotte went missing, the police stationed an officer at her family's house. On October 1st, very early in the morning, even before dawn, while Charlotte's parents, David and Tricia Senna, were still searching for their daughter in the park, a car pulled up near their house. The police officer saw an unknown man place something in the family's mailbox at 4:20 a.m. The officer began to move toward the man, but he quickly jumped into the car and drove off. Attempts to catch him were unsuccessful, although the officer noted the model of the car. To the police's surprise, there was a note demanding ransom in the mailbox. The man wanted $50,000 in exchange for Charlotte. Allegedly, he forced her to write the note herself. The officer received criticism for not being able to stop the stranger. It was an opportunity to capture the kidnapper and save the child. He saw the man leave the letter, but the officer couldn't guess what the man left in the mailbox. When people learn about a child's disappearance, many send letters of support, cards, and flowers to the parents. However, this note turned out to be crucial for Charlotte's rescue. The kidnapper must have assumed that there would be no one at home at that time and no one would see him. So he came so early, but he left a very important clue. On Monday, October 2nd at 2:30 p.m., an unexpected breakthrough occurred in the case. Forensic experts found a fingerprint on the note. They ran the fingerprint through the database and got a match. It belonged to Craig Ross, previously accused of driving under the influence in Saratoga Springs in 1999. His phone ping also matched the phones of people in the park at the time of Charlotte's abduction, and Craig was one of them. The police also traced a car registered to Craig back to his mother's home in Bolton Spa, New York. Craig himself lived in a small motorhome behind his mother's house. In cases like this, DNA often plays a significant role, but this time, an old fingerprint, matching a previous case of drunk driving, was discovered on the letter. Surely DNA would be found on the note given the presence of the fingerprint, but comparing fingerprints happens 1,000 times faster. The match was discovered at 2:30 p.m. By 6:30 p.m., the police and FBI had already surrounded Craig's house. They had a warrant, but it wasn't necessary when a child's life was at stake. Neighbors of Craig mentioned that the apprehension of the suspect resembled more of a crime thriller, and they never expected to witness something like that. Around 6 p.m. on Monday, Charlene and her elder daughter Briella, who is 11 years old, noticed quite a few officers about 200 meters from their house. A neighbor living near Craig mentioned that around 6 p.m., she saw 2 cars stop on her lawn, and she went out to shoo away the ill-mannered drivers, but suddenly policemen in bulletproof vests and armed to the teeth emerged from the cars. At least 15 cars of the apprehension team and police gathered near Craig's house. At least 30 officers in full gear, armed with weapons and flash grenades, poured out of them and immediately sprang into action. At that moment, the neighbors couldn't fathom that their neighbor was holding the missing girl against her will. However, all doubts vanished when they spotted an ambulance, a helicopter hovering overhead, and a convoy of police and FBI vehicles near their homes. The neighbors, witnessing the suspect's capture, feared he might run towards them and take them and their children as hostages. But the officers acted swiftly and didn't let the situation spiral out of control. 20 members of the apprehension team stormed into the house and arrested Craig. He resisted and sustained minor injuries during the arrest. When they apprehended him, the man was in his underwear. Finding the girl was not easy. She was hidden in a small closet in the man's bedroom and additionally covered. Charlotte immediately understood that the officers had come to rescue her. It was a very emotional moment when she realized that everything would be okay, and she would soon see her parents and sisters. Interestingly, the girl was wearing a sweatshirt that was too big for her. Considering that Craig himself was in his underwear while the girl was in a sweatshirt, one can only be grateful that his motive was money. While she was entirely in his power, he could have done whatever he wanted with the girl, and the outcome of the rescue operation wouldn't have been as joyful. By 6:32 p.m., the police informed Charlotte's parents that their daughter had been rescued, was alive, and unharmed. Craig's neighbor recounted that she caught a glimpse of Charlotte's face and shouted, "It's her, she's there." She watched as Charlotte was taken into the ambulance. The woman admitted that she desperately wanted to hug and hold Charlotte until her mother arrived and assured her daughter of her safety. The girl, during these few days, became like family to all the concerned people who had been worrying about her. Everyone prayed for her and wished for her safe return home, including the police officers. Everyone witnessed that after the successful operation to rescue abducted Charlotte, they breathed a sigh of relief, rejoiced, congratulated each other, and patted each other on the back. It was an astonishing moment. When the police officers learned who the kidnapper might be, they stormed the house, setting 2 goals: apprehend the kidnapper and save Charlotte alive. In this case, everything ended better than one could have ever dreamed of. The girl is safe and unharmed, and the criminal has been captured. But what if his motive hadn't been money? By the time they realized who he was, it would have been too late. It's terrifying even to think about it. Charlotte was immediately taken to the hospital, and after a health check, she was released home to her family. Besides the obvious shock after the abduction, Charlotte is perfectly healthy. Of course, it's not all over for her because she'll still have to answer questions about the kidnapping and how she spent her time in captivity. Investigators will involve specialists who know how to talk to young victims to avoid causing Charlotte additional trauma. On October 2nd, a press conference was held during which the press was informed about a major breakthrough in the three-day search for the girl. On literally the following day, October 3rd, 47-year-old Craig was charged with first-degree kidnapping, and this was not his first encounter with the police. Firstly, in 1999, he was arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol. At that time, his fingerprints were taken, which were entered into the police database, enabling authorities to link him to Charlotte's abduction. Then, in 2016, he was arrested for second-degree stalking, and a year later, his girlfriend obtained a restraining order against him after he grabbed her by the neck and attempted to strangle her. Just a month before Charlotte's kidnapping, the police were investigating his involvement in violence against his 12-year-old relative, but the case was closed. It's reported that the man moved into a trailer on his mother's property because he suffers from multiple sclerosis. His condition was so severe that he couldn't continue living in his former residence in Porter's Corners, New York, due to missed payments. Craig has 2 adult children and an 11-year-old daughter. Neighbors describe him as a reclusive person. However, at times, they saw him working in the yard of his house and spending time with his 11-year-old daughter, who lives with him several days a week. Regarding the man's older children, Craig's son stated that he doesn't want to hear anything about his father, considers his actions appalling, and doesn't wish to have anything to do with him. Currently, Craig is held in jail on a first-degree kidnapping charge without the possibility of bail. He has been provided with a free lawyer who will represent him in court. Officially, the motive for the abduction is not disclosed, but considering the ransom note, one could assume that financial gain played a significant role. Although the police are not very forthcoming with information, the former girlfriend of Craig, Amanda Priest, had quite a bit to share. She described Craig as someone who despised working and always sought out people he could rely on for support. Amanda is convinced that money was definitely the motive, but interestingly, Craig seemed to have targeted not just any child, but specifically Charlotte. The issue traces back to an incident involving Charlotte's grandfather, Patrick Sena, who filed a lawsuit against Greenfield in 1998 following a sledding incident. He received a settlement of $2 million, widely known among the residents of Saratoga. Craig was aware of this and might have been keeping an eye on the family to find out where they lived, their frequent whereabouts, and more. According to Amanda, this is precisely why Craig abducted the man's granddaughter and demanded ransom, hoping to get money to improve his financial situation. Amanda also shared that not long ago, Craig put tarps on the windows of his trailer. Therefore, she has no doubt that everything was planned meticulously. He was monitoring the family, observing them, knew Charlotte's routine, likely tracked them from home to the park, and waited for an opportunity when the girl would be alone. And that opportunity arose when Charlotte decided to take a final bike ride without her friends. While the investigation into Charlotte Sena's case continues, investigators are exploring a possible connection of the suspect to other crimes, including the abduction and murder of 18-year-old Jennifer Hammond and 19-year-old Christina White. At present, there is no evidence linking him to these cases, but investigators are probing his involvement in any major incidents in the region as a standard procedure. The cases of Jennifer and Christina, believed to be linked by investigators, remain unsolved since the disappearances in 2003 and 2005, respectively, from Milton, the same town where Craig lived for decades. Jennifer's boss reported her disappearance on November 2, 2003. Colleagues dropped her off at the Creek and Pines trailer park, where she was supposed to sell magazines, but no one saw her after that. All the girl's belongings were later found in a hotel room in Albany, where she was staying with colleagues. 2 years later, it became known about Christina's disappearance after her family last saw her in the evening on June 30, 2005. Witnesses told investigators they saw her walking along a road 5 kilometers from home. Christina's remains, essentially just a skeleton, were found by hunters in March 2006 in the Daketown Forest in Greenfield, 16 kilometers from where she was last seen. The autopsy revealed that the killer inflicted fatal blows to Christina's chest and abdomen. Jennifer's remains were found a few kilometers away in October 2009. Details of her death are not disclosed, but investigators stated that the girls were likely killed by the same perpetrator given where they were abducted from and where their bodies were left. Criminal profiler John Kelly commented on the case. Craig Ross presumably abducted Charlotte, but we know that the best predictor of present or future behavior is past behavior. Therefore, it's always important to find out if a person has committed abductions in the past. John Kelly added that whoever abducted Christina and Jennifer was well acquainted with the area and likely preferred red-haired girls. Apparently, Craig's route from the park to home passes through wooded areas associated with these two unsolved murders. So, there could indeed be a connection. He was monitoring the family and might have thought that since he had successfully abducted people before, he could do it again, but instead of committing murder, he could demand ransom and at the same time improve his financial situation. In any case, the investigation continues to establish whether he is linked to other crimes. In the meantime, the police have questioned him to ascertain if he was monitoring Charlotte and whether his intentions went beyond financial needs. The Sena family expressed their gratitude to everyone who tirelessly worked to bring their daughter home. They are, of course, very relieved that Charlotte is back home and acknowledge how fortunate they are that everything ended this way. They understand that not every abducted child returns home safe and sound. Amidst the bustling city streets and crowded shopping centers, Lois Pearson always preferred the peaceful seclusion of a small wooden house nestled among green hills where she had grown up. Her family had lived there since her birth in 1949, and Lois hardly ever left her ancestral home. She lived on a modest income from leasing her land to a man who grazed his cattle on it. After her mother's passing, Lois found herself relying more on her own resources. A few years ago, when her pipes froze, she decided to do without running water and carried water from a well. In her daily activities, she used a single lamp, which she carried from room to room on a long cord. Every Sunday, Lois attended church, and once a month, she would travel to the nearest town, Mineral Wells, to buy groceries and do laundry at a self-service laundromat. She always felt more comfortable with animals in nature and often spent entire days without interacting with other people. Lois never had a boyfriend. She never even undressed in front of a man, not even a doctor. Lois met Jeffrey Maxwell in 2001, shortly after he acquired land in Weatherford, Texas, located to the west of her property. At that time, Maxwell was just under 50 years old, while Lois was slightly over 50. They exchanged a few words on occasion, and he would wave to her as he passed by her house. Once, Maxwell invited her to have lunch with him. The invitation caught Lois off guard, and she declined in her usual gentle manner. On another occasion, he came to her house, jumped out of his car, and out of the blue asked for a kiss. Lois felt offended, especially by the expectant smirk on his face. She demanded that he never come to her house again. In 2005, he moved away, but to her immense surprise, they crossed paths again before his departure. Their conversation was brief and unburdened. He stopped by to show her pictures of a modular home he was building in Corsicana and to bid farewell. Little did Lois know that this farewell visit would not be her last encounter with Jeffrey Maxwell. On the afternoon of March 1st, 2011, Lois was preparing for her regular trip to town for groceries. She was getting ready to leave when a silver Chevy Trailblazer pulled up behind her 1970 Nova car. If he had arrived just 5 minutes later, he would have missed her. Maxwell warmly greeted Lois and smiled. He stepped out of his car and engaged her in a conversation about the church. As she replied, he began slowly approaching her, and she started backing away. Their movements quickly led them to the back of her house. Feeling slightly embarrassed by the nearby containers of well water, Lois attempted to steer Maxwell back towards the driveway. Suddenly, she noticed a strange shift in his expression. It was so evident that they both stopped talking. Maxwell reached into his coat pocket for a container with an odd lid and held it up to Lois's face. Before she could say anything, he released a stream of pepper spray, attempting to hit both of her eyes. However, the spray had no effect. Lois turned and ran toward the barbed wire fence near her car. Lois had barely reached the fence and put her hands on the top wire when he caught up to her. Grabbing her, he lifted her up, but she held onto the wire even as the spikes dug into her fingers and blood dripped from her hands. Yet he was too strong and managed to throw her to the ground in front of his SUV. Lois attempted to scream as loudly as she could, but her house was secluded and there was no one around. Maxwell picked Lois up again, put what seemed like handcuffs on her, and opened the back door of her house. She struggled to free herself as he pushed her into the kitchen. He grabbed a wooden rolling pin from the kitchen table, her mother's rolling pin, and struck Lois on the left side of her head. When she didn't fall, he swung again, hitting her harder on the right side this time. The blow sent her to the floor. Lois felt her eyelids swell almost instantly, but she continued to fight to escape until he grabbed a large kitchen knife. She sat down quietly, feeling the blood and dizziness. Maxwell asked where she kept duct tape. She remained silent. He repeated the question but got no response. He then cut the cord of her lamp into pieces and tied Lois to the living room door handle. He went outside to his car. He was gone for just a few seconds, but she managed to free her wrists. She had always had rather slender wrists. She jumped up and ran out the door in the opposite direction. By the time he returned to the house, realized she was missing, and jumped in his car, Lois had already run a few hundred yards down the road, even with ankle cuffs on. Maxwell chased after her, braking right in front of her and blocking her path. He stepped out of the car with a gun in his hand. "Now we're moving on to Plan B," he said with a chilling expression on his face. He opened the back door of his car and pushed her inside, fastening handcuffs on her again. Then he used a small piece of duct tape to cover her mouth. "Are you a virgin?" he asked, grinning. That's when she started crying. He laughed at her tears, slammed the door shut, and got behind the wheel. As he drove away, he told her he would have to come back and burn down her house. Lois heard the car pulling onto the highway. She thought about trying to lift her feet so that passing drivers would notice her handcuffs and help her. But realizing the car had tinted windows and other drivers wouldn't see her, she felt utterly helpless. She considered hitting Maxwell with a tire iron, but she knew it would only enrage him further. She also thought about opening the back door and rolling out onto the road, but she couldn't find the handle. Maxwell heard her praying and promised that after he was done with her, she would stop believing in him. The car veered off the road. The terrain was unfamiliar to Lois. The abductor led her into the garage of a house and closed the door behind her. She surveyed the room, cluttered with a variety of items. There was patio furniture, a lawnmower, numerous tools, a washing machine, and a dryer in the corner. Maxwell unfastened her handcuffs. He began removing Lois's clothes, everything except her bra. He cut it off with a knife. Then he attached each of her hands to the ends of a steel pole suspended from the ceiling by chains. Without comprehending what was happening, she watched as he flicked a switch on the yellow control panel attached to the ceiling by a cable, at the same point where the chains were connected. She felt her arms rise first, then her shoulders lifted abruptly. The motor in the ceiling hummed as she ascended higher and higher. When Maxwell flicked the switch again, the motor went silent, and Lois felt her naked legs dangling helplessly in the air. Jeffrey Maxwell was known for his ability to escape from any situation, whether it was burning down his own house for insurance money or shooting cattle to avoid feeding them, or even something far more sinister. Maxwell could always manage to avoid punishment. He got to know Martha Martinez from Mexico through postal correspondence in the early 1980s. They exchanged letters for a long time, and eventually Jeffrey traveled to Mexico and proposed to her. Her family wasn't initially fond of him because he skillfully played on her insecurities and lack of self-confidence. Her family begged her not to marry Maxwell, but the 29-year-old woman believed that this was her chance to become a wife and mother. She married Maxwell, moved with him to Watauga, a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, and gave birth to a son. This was Maxwell's third child. At 18, he had married his girlfriend Rita when she became pregnant, but they divorced in 1979 after the birth of their second child. Although Martha kept her husband's behavior hidden from her family, she couldn't hide the bruises on her arms and legs, as if from shackles, from her friends. But this was nothing compared to the horror that Martha would experience later. On Sunday, April 19, 1987, a deputy sheriff from Ardmore, Oklahoma, called the police station in Watauga, Texas. He reported that early that morning, they found a woman on the road. She had been severely beaten, and she had lost a lot of blood due to a deep wound on her neck. The woman was Martha Maxwell. The police immediately went to the family's home and questioned Maxwell about the last time he had seen his wife. He claimed not to have seen her since the night before and expressed surprise when told that Martha was injured but alive. Fortunately, doctors managed to save her life. Upon regaining consciousness, she recounted how she and her husband had argued. He beat her, and she fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up tied with duct tape. After further abuse, Maxwell forced her to drink a liquid that caused her to immediately fall asleep. She woke up in the hospital. Initially, Martha cooperated with the police, but after her husband's arrest and charges of kidnapping were filed against him, she suddenly stopped communicating with investigators. Without her testimony, the police couldn't charge Maxwell with anything, as a search of the house and car yielded no evidence. Jeffrey Maxwell slipped through the cracks again. Martha took her son and left for Mexico. However, her husband wasn't going to let her go so easily. He bombarded her with letters, playing on her Catholic upbringing and even accusing her of what had happened. Her family pleaded with Martha not to return to Jeffrey, but just a month after the charges against him were dropped, she was back living with him. It seemed like life was getting back on track for the family. Martha enrolled in college, and they bought a new house. But it was just the calm before the storm. On May 10, 1992, two family members received letters from her, or supposedly from her. Martha wrote that she was leaving her husband and son and didn't plan to have any contact for a while. Her family didn't believe that the letters were from Martha. Firstly, she usually just called them. Secondly, if she had written a letter, it would have been in Spanish, not English. When Martha's brother called Maxwell, he said that Martha had left and hung up. He had to come to Texas to file a missing person report for his sister. He was convinced that she was dead, and it was her husband's fault because she would never have left without money, documents, a car, and most importantly, her beloved son. However, the search for Martha yielded no results. Years later, when police asked him if he had done anything that might have led to his wife Martha's death, Maxwell replied, "Not intentionally." A few years after her disappearance, Jeffrey filed for divorce. Once the divorce was granted, he immediately remarried his first wife, Rita, and she and her 3 daughters from her second marriage moved in with him. Soon enough, the girls began complaining at school about their stepfather's advances, and Rita's best friend revealed that just 2 days before their wedding, Maxwell had assaulted her. However, it was only after police visited the family's home due to complaints from Rita's youngest daughter about her stepfather's behavior that Rita took the children, left the state, changed her name, and escaped. Lifting Lois into the air, Maxwell began yelling at her. He was still angry that she hadn't listened to him in the car. The woman felt his hands on her, then sensed something hard and pointed, reminiscent of a plastic bullet. It seemed he was trying to use this vibrating object to cause her pain, and it was truly painful. Stating that Lois would be with him for 2 weeks, Maxwell started hitting her, using different sizes of rods. He struck her everywhere, even on her chest, which was unbearable. Lois could do nothing but scream in agony. When he finally lowered her to the floor, she could barely stand. Maxwell led her to the bathroom and ordered her to wash up. At first, she caught a glimpse of bruises all over her body. Her right eyelid was swollen to the point that she could barely see, fearing she might lose her eye. The abductor himself quickly took a shower and gave her his jeans. They were oversized for Lois and smelled like Maxwell. It was terrible, but she understood that she would survive longer if she didn't provoke him over trivial matters. That night, he chained her ankles to the bed, turned off the lights, and lay down beside her. Lois couldn't close her eyes, and Maxwell hardly slept. Every time she turned toward him, she encountered his round, owl-like eyes, visible even in the darkness. Thus passed her first night away from home in over 40 years. When the morning of the second day came, Maxwell told Lois that he needed to go to the store to buy more padlocks. He led her to the garage and showed her a homemade wooden box. The wood looked and smelled new. He suggested to her a choice, a torture device or a box. Her decision was instantaneous. She would do anything, just not get on that machine. Maxwell inserted a metal ring into her mouth as a gag and secured it with a strap. Then he fastened handcuffs and shackles on Lois and ordered her to lie in the box. Through the gag, she asked if she would have enough air. Maxwell placed a wrench on the edge of the box, leaving the lid slightly ajar, and then left. Lois waited a few seconds after hearing the sound of his car's engine. Then she tried to get out of the box, but no matter how hard she pushed, she only managed to push the key away and lock herself in complete darkness. It was only when Maxwell returned that she realized he had moved the box under a heavy workbench. Upon returning home, the abductor led Lois to the bedroom and undressed her. Her parents had never discussed intimate matters with Lois, and she didn't know what he was doing, but she felt uncomfortable. When she screamed in pain, he asked her how she would like to go to the garage and hang upside down. After that, she tried not to make a sound. When he finished, he chained her legs to the bed again. That night, exhausted, she managed to get some sleep. In the morning, Maxwell had to go to Dallas to pay a bill for his son's repair. He put a gag in her mouth and chained her as usual. Lois could hear cars, motorcycles, and motorboats in the distance. She screamed and called for help, but because of the gag, no one could hear her cries. Only when Maxwell returned and removed the metal ring from her mouth did Lois realize that he had broken her front teeth. But on that day, she lost something much more important. On television, they showed a photo of her driver's license, and Maxwell allowed her to watch the news. That's how Lois Pearson learned that the house where she had grown up, holding so many memories, was no longer there, and she was listed as missing, and they were searching for her. The following days were similar, one to another. In the mornings, he satisfied his needs with her and then left her alone. For several days, he ensured she was chained to the bed, even when he quickly took a shower or went to the mailbox. But gradually, the abductor became less cautious. One day, she noticed he had left his mobile phone in the bathroom. The thought crossed her mind to take it and call the police. But she had never used a mobile phone before and was afraid she might do something wrong. She worried that he would not only stop trusting her, but also use that torture device again. Lois abandoned that idea, but she never stopped pondering an escape, or at least a way to shift the power balance. And after a week in captivity, she saw a way to fend off his persistent advances. On the 7th day, as he lay beside her and moved his mouth towards hers, she recalled her parents' words. They had told her that supposedly there was a bronchitis-inducing agent in her oral cavity. This was one of the reasons why she never kissed boys when she was younger. So, she allowed him to touch her lips, referring to this maneuver as a battle of microbes. What actually happened then is hard to discern now, but the next day Maxwell woke up with a fever and chills. He was pale and could barely get out of bed. He didn't attempt to use her again. On the morning of the 8th day, he demanded that she write him a check for $500. He explained that groceries cost money and instructed her to date it February 2nd, more than a month earlier. He had already taken $60 from her wallet, which she had prepared for shopping in town, but she didn't object, hoping that the money would help her buy a few more days. It was March 12, 2011. The clock's hands were approaching 6 in the evening when Sergeant Ricky Montgomery and 4 other police officers pulled up to a modest house on the shores of a lake in Corsicana, 80 kilometers south of Dallas, to ask the homeowner a few questions about the missing 62-year-old woman. After her house had burned down and her remains were nowhere to be found, search teams began combing the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imaging were brought in for the search, but after a few days, the police came to the grim conclusion that they wouldn't find Lois Pearson alive. The efforts continued with search dogs trained to find bodies, and they even brought in pumps to drain 2 ponds, but the woman was nowhere to be found. Then, 8 days after the fire, $500 were withdrawn from her account. The check was made out to Jeffrey Maxwell and dated a few weeks prior. When the police found out that Maxwell also owned a blue SUV matching the description of the vehicle seen by a neighbor on the day of the fire, a judge issued a search warrant for the vehicle, and officers traveled over 160 kilometers to question the man. Sunday, March 12th, unfolded like any other day. The 12th day of Lois's captivity under Maxwell proceeded like usual. Lois sat on the floor praying while Maxwell watched television when they both heard a knock at the door. The abductor jumped up and quickly led Lois to a distant room, instructing her to stay quiet. Before he could handcuff her or put a gag on her, they heard another knock, even more persistent. The man hurried to the door. Lois could hear voices from outside but couldn't make out the conversation. She managed to escape the room, and through the window, she saw the word sheriff on a car parked by the road. At first, fear immobilized her entire body, which surprised her. But then she realized it was her chance, and she ran. Jeffrey Maxwell emerged from the house and firmly closed the door behind him. He smiled at the police officers, and in an apologetic tone said that his house was in a terrible mess. Sergeant Ricky Montgomery explained that they were questioning people who knew Miss Lois Pearson, or those who had recently been in the vicinity of her house. Maxwell replied that Lois was his neighbor, but he hadn't seen her in a long time. He added that Lois had sent him a check because she owed him money. Montgomery continued to ask Maxwell if he would be willing to come to the sheriff's office when the door swung wide open. They heard a weak voice of an older woman. The woman appeared frail, hunched over, her unkempt hair tangled, and her face covered in bruises. She swiftly slipped past Maxwell and approached the officers. Although Montgomery had a photograph of the missing woman, he didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" he asked. Before she could answer, one of the officers behind Montgomery exclaimed in surprise, "It's her, Lois Pearson," she confirmed. Everyone present was momentarily stunned. Regaining their composure, the police officers handcuffed Maxwell. At first, the woman told the officers that Maxwell had been her friend and hadn't done anything to her. Later, she learned about the term Stockholm Syndrome, but all she remembers about her rescue is the fear for her life. After a few minutes, when Maxwell was taken away, Lois told the officers that he had kidnapped her, beaten her, and done things to her that she didn't want. At first, the officers didn't understand what she meant when she mentioned the machine. But as soon as they searched the house, they found the device she described and a yellow control device covered in blood. They also found whips, handcuffs, weapons, 4 adult toys of varying sizes, and numerous pieces of adhesive tape throughout the house. Blood was on the bedding, on the floor in front of the car, and on various items of clothing in the house. The police also discovered an extensive collection of adult films. 3 days of questioning later, Maxwell confessed to nearly everything. The trial began on February 14, 2012. In the months between his arrest and the trial, Maxwell lost over 60 pounds and shaved his beard. Now he appeared as a lanky, ghostly figure in an ill-fitting suit. The jury took less than an hour to find Maxwell guilty on all 3 counts. The judge had prohibited mentioning his wife Martha's disappearance during the trial, but the jurors heard from Rita's friend, whom Maxwell had assaulted 2 days before their wedding. Testimonies were also given by Rita's daughters, who described the impact of stepfather's advances on them. Lois also testified in court. She had always been shy about speaking in public, but now she spoke firmly about what she had endured during those 12 days of captivity. She described the injuries that continued to trouble her even a year later and remembered the 3 cats, Bluey, Blackie, and a nameless kitten that had perished in the fire. Most of all, she thought that if she remained innocent throughout her life, she would be rewarded in heaven. Again, the jury took less than an hour to sentence the defendant to 3 consecutive life terms. The judge ruled that he would not serve the sentences concurrently, meaning that Maxwell would be eligible for parole no sooner than 119 years. After the verdict, a crowd watched as a deputy sheriff handcuffed Maxwell's wrists and shackled his ankles before leading him out of the courtroom. Normally, victims of such crimes don't want their names mentioned in the media, but after the trial, Lois told reporters that she wanted her story to be known so that everyone could hear how her faith had carried her through difficult times. Sometimes she wonders why he chose her. Perhaps Maxwell knew that if she disappeared from home for a few days, no one would notice. The perfect victim. Had he not made a mistake and not put her to sleep, someone might have searched for her. Someone might have noticed she was missing. After the 12 days with Jeffrey Maxwell, Lois was left with memories of her former life. He took away much more than just her home or the car she loved. He took her piano and her mother's sheet music. Now she no longer has a photograph of her father, and she's unsure if one even exists. Her church raised over $17,000 to buy her a small trailer. It's not the home she grew up in, but the old house was always cold in winter and infested with pests, while the trailer is cozy and warm. The church even gifted her a new piano, and she now has a phone. Lois Pearson still prefers the tranquility of nature, but she relishes the time she spends with her new friends. "Before this, I never knew how much I loved people," she confesses.